an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Look at that. The 26th day of June as we record this today. The final week of June, heading for the summer months in this part of the world. Interesting to see how people start to gear down. You got kids in the house, of course, everybody's squirrely because it's the last week of school. If you're a teacher, you're putting up with that. Right? Yeah. And we make the turn into Canada Day, 4th of July for our American friends. And here comes summer. So there's lots going on here at Story Studio Network. And I'll just tell you that this week, got lots to talk about. Today we're going to get into a conversation about the future of media and the future of work in media, particularly in this country. You know that Bell Media has been in the headlines lately because it decided to shutter 6 radio stations across the country, sell off 3 more, and laid off 1,300 people. Most of them journalists. And that's just the latest in a long list of layoffs and so on, as far as major legacy media is concerned. And it's not just happening in Canada, but particularly in Canada. We've got some unique issues around all of that, thanks to government involvement in the CRTC. Bad combination. Lisa Taylor is going to join us in the program. Lisa is the president of Challenge Factory. She is an expert in the future of work. And I wanted her take on how that lens applies now to media in this part of the world. So we'll get to that. We chatted with her last week. You'll hear I still got a bit of the COVID frog in my throat. Tomorrow we will assemble the round table and sift through the entrails. Post-election here, we're going to have a new mayor declared later today in Toronto. And without getting into the details of who should and why they should, if you want to know my breakdown on the candidates and what Toronto needs, yeah, we talked about that in an earlier episode here last week, Wednesday, on Now and Next. So jump into that if you want to. Otherwise, if you're listening today and it isn't 8 o'clock yet, p.m. on the Monday, and you're in Toronto, and you're eligible, get your ass out the door and vote. Yes, please. Thank you. So we're going to talk about that on Tuesday. And then Wednesday, we're into festival season in this part of the world. And it's nice to see the festivals all coming back to life. Michael Hollett is the CEO at North by Northeast. They just had an extraordinary Get Back to Business festival. The TD Jazz Festival is underway here in Toronto. Good to see people back out and about, and enjoying the music live, enjoying the events live. It's been so hard on the musicians and all the entertainers and the producers and so on because everything trying to be done remotely. But I wanted to check up on our friends at Mariposa. It's coming up. I think the festival is next weekend. So it's the first full week. It's the weekend after Canada Day. They sold out. Yeah. That's great news. I mean, it's bad news if you were hoping to get up to Aurelia to catch some of the shows, but they've sold out. Well done. So we're going to talk about that and how the festival has been rejuvenated now into its 62nd year. Yeah. So good fun. So that's the week on tap. And of course, then Thursday, we'll get back to feed drop day, and continuing our conversation around the next normal. And then for the coming weeks, we're going to dial things back just a little bit. We're going to go to Tuesday and Thursday in July. And we've got a few other things working in Story Studio Network, and Aaron and I will tell you about it. But big doings, so lots on the deck. We've got some real production work in the background that we are trying to get out the door. setting up a bunch of new shows, including new shows for me and for Aaron. So all of that is in the offing. All right, let's get to the conversation of the day. I mean, since Lisa and I talked, which was back on the 21st of June, there have been more issues around local media having challenges. Post media now, I just read this morning, the Montreal Gazette is down to one news manager in the newsroom. One single manager for the whole newsroom. So it's not just broadcast media that is suffering. It is media in general, and particularly journalism. And what can we do about it, if anything? Are there opportunities here? And so we do talk to Lisa Taylor. Lisa is as I said, the president at Challenge Factory, and get her take on where we have seen this happen before, how a sector or an industry has recovered. Is it possible? And does this mean that, in fact, there is a place for the big conglomerates, the big, large corporations, when it comes to journalism, when it comes to media, particularly media that serves local community? It's easy to say, kind of glibly, oh, well, it's the future of work now in media. And when we look at how the number of jobs that are being lost, et cetera. And I got into an exchange with Tony Chapman last week in the wake of the Bell cuts. And, Tony kind of laying out what was going on and asked for thoughts, and I offered them up. And in fact, in some case, I think when you actually look at the way the big telecoms are constructed, they just aren't in a place anymore. They're not built to be in radio, TV, or certainly not in news. And so I think that we're going to see a shift in that. There has to be, because I don't imagine for a second that television, radio, or news is going to go out of fashion. Now, it'll change for sure. But it prompted me to think about, this in the context of the future of work. So who better to call on than Lisa Taylor from Challenge Factory. And, when I look at those big numbers in terms of layoffs, it's frightening. That's not just an isolated incident. These have been going on for a long time. Where cutting, and I don't say this to single out Bell. There are a lot of big companies that do this, where cutting is viewed as the solution. Is there a breaking point here in terms of corporate culture where, you kind of have to reset all of that, because cutting can't be, you want to grow. It can't be the answer.
Right. I think that's a really good point. And I think that, the media sector and what we're seeing in communications now really mirrors what we saw in the tech sector about 20 years ago. That's the sector that I came from before I started Challenge Factory, where companies were becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and they were becoming all things: applications, outsourcing, infrastructure, security, like all kinds of aspects of everything that had anything to do with technology at all. And then we started to see that there were massive rounds of layoffs and cuts as different divisions of the business was deemed to be less profitable or less successful or less, quote unquote, strategic. And having to watch and see how the industry reacted on both sides of the fence. The culture inside of organizations, which was decimated, which then gave rise to tons of small players starting to emerge and say, you know what, maybe we don't have to be all things to all people. We can be experts and specialists in this component of technology. And you saw the whole ecosystem just start to explode with entrepreneurship. So I do think, as we take a look at communications and what's happening there, that this idea that there could be these massive conglomerates that could be all things to all people related to communications, whether that's your cell phone, your landline, your cable TV, your radio station, you name it. I think that we are at that breaking point where, the culture within those organizations is going to suffer. And we are going to see all kinds of new spinoffs and opportunities for people to say, well, especially with media, that's a public good, and we need to protect it beyond just the culture of the organizations that we're working for. Let's invest in how we might have in the small an opportunity to advance this public good so that good journalism and good media continues, even if it's outside of the bounds of these large giant conglomerates.
Yeah, and I agree in principle with that. But if you go back to the idea of the tech and, sort of that reorganization and reconfiguration of the tech sector, startups happened, and because there seemed to be a need. Here's the challenge, I think, and I blame to some degree journalism itself as a sector, that has never been viewed as a business, quite frankly. It has been viewed as a public service that others have afforded to us. So the big companies have said, yes, we're going to have, Hawaii 5-0 on whatever night. And by the way, we'll also throw in the newscast at whatever time a day. And it has never been a profit center. So there's the challenge, I think, because we really have to shift our perspective on that, not just from the public's perspective, but, I'm pointing the finger at me and guys in my industry who have always thought this is where we go. You use the word entrepreneur. If that news organization at any level is going to survive, we need to inject a certain spirit or educational component of entrepreneurialism in there, right?
Right. And I mean, I think that starts right back at education and in explaining, what is journalism? You and I were chatting off the air a little bit just about family and kids. And so that I have kids that are on their way in, either already in post-secondary or on their way to post-secondary, and they really have no idea what journalism or communication is. And so starting to really explain early on and in those early programs, what is it now? And what are the skills that we need to be fostering so that we can have entrepreneurial and creative journalism in this country that adheres to the journalistic standards that we need in order to protect democracy? I mean, this is not selling shoes. This is different than a lot of other professions where there's, obligations and professional standards that are really important for key social structures. But at the same time, where's the opportunity? And I think there's enormous opportunity. One of my friends and colleagues has been in journalism for, more than 20 years and was looking for a new opportunity last year and was shocked to find just how many producer roles there were outside of traditional media companies. Until he had gone looking himself, he really had never given any thought that there's an opportunity to take the skills that he has and to produce not just corporate content or marketing content, but actual news content in ways that are useful to all kinds of different industry associations and opportunities in organizations that are wanting to make that kind of impact. So the kernels, the warning signs are there, of course. I mean, massive layoffs is a massive call. Closing journalism programs in educational institutions is a massive call that says something is shifting. But the seeds of opportunity and hope are also there too. You just have to know how to look for them and how to find them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I posted, a couple of the closures at Mohawk and Loyalist College in the past week, and one is a radio program, the other one is a journalism program that's been suspended. But as I kind of step back from that, and I'd be curious to get your perspective on this vis-a-vis your future of work lens, we have kind of put the journalists and the broadcasters in this box. And you have to come out of that program with that level of experience in the school, etc. I'm pushing 40 years and I never did a journalism program. I never did a broadcast program. Right. And there are many in my generation who didn't. And guys that I worked with and for, same thing. I would not call them anything less than a journalist in terms of their rigor and their, adherence to some of the expectations and standards that you point out. I begin to wonder whether or not the opportunity around this is to kind of break that mold almost right away.
Yeah. And I think what you're highlighting, there's kind of two trends that I would point to there. The first is for the younger boomer cohort, reliance on educational degrees and formal professionalization is not necessarily a part of everyone's background. The market was different. You kind of finished school, you went right into the workforce, there was jobs, and you were able to kind of navigate your career as you went through that. So that's really common that people will look back and say, well, geez, I've been in human resources for 30 years and don't have an advanced degree in human resources or in marketing or in any of the different disciplines. And that's a little bit of just the economy at the time and the role that education played. Now in Canada, we've developed into this era where we have hyper-specialized education. maybe a little bit too much. And what we're starting to see is actually institutions are adopting European models of teaching that is moving away from that hyper specialization where, you haven't been out to work yet, but you have 6 years or 8 years of detailed education in a very focused field, to something that's called integrated learning. So integrated learning is where there may be something that you're interested in, but it gets integrated across a broad set of subjects. So you may be interested in physics, but you learn about physics in the context of every single type of science and math and psychology, all integrated together in pursuit of solving a problem. I think as we take a look and see, and it's happening in the arts and the social sciences as well, these integrated degrees that combine business degrees and the humanities, putting things together that we don't normally see. I think that's really the future for journalistic education. It's less about, do I have a dedicated journalism degree, and more about, do I have a background in social change and environmentalism, in some of the key topics of the day where there's a very strong thread on the role of journalism and media as part of that education. And I think that more and more, if you take a look at what's being offered in our post-secondary institutions, they're moving towards these integrated degrees. And I think that that's really important. On the employer side, I see one other trend that's emerging, and Challenge Factory is certainly a part of this. And that is that there's a recognition that the way that corporations are set up and held accountable and what it means to be a corporation in capitalism is shifting. So, the new kind of category, which is not so new, but it's just gaining a little bit more traction. It's been around for a long time, of B corporations that actually change their legal documents to demonstrate and to put an extra layer of responsibility beyond fiduciary responsibility to shareholders, to take into account impact decisions have on employees, stakeholders, community, and the environment. B corporations have this added layer of looking at what's the role of major corporations beyond just giving profits back to shareholders, and instead, what's the social role that these corporations have? And that's a very formal structure. It's audited, it's public, and we're seeing an increase slowly in Canada, but certainly around the world, where institutions and large organizations, not just small and medium-sized companies like Challenge Factory, are saying, you know what? We actually want to be part of a different type of capitalism, and these are the structures that are starting to emerge. And decisions like mass layoffs are done in a very different way, if they're done at all, when you have that extra responsibility written into your legal documents to have to account for how did you consider the impact this will have on workers and communities, for example. Shutting radio stations has a massive impact on communities. So how has that been factored in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I listen to you talk about that sort of integrated educational model, it's what we might have called a liberal arts education, but more deliberate, right? In that sense. But it's interesting. Back to I'm sure my Celtic studies minor and my major in English literature has gone a long way to inform my journalism. but the idea, though, that I even listened to Chris Licht was up until about a week and a half ago the CEO at CNN, and just dropped right off the cliff when he did that interview with the Atlantic. But part of I don't know if you read it, but part of the conversation that he engaged in was the nature and the quality of journalists generally. And to your point, he wanted to know, where is the single mom who's had to live on food stamps to raise her family? Where is she in the newsroom? Where are those lived experiences in the newsroom? Some guy who, grew up and never went to school necessarily, but could take the car apart and put it back together with his eyes closed, brings that level of logistics and smarts to the room that I have a blind spot for. But all of a sudden, the diversity in that room is exceptional, as opposed to everybody being in that lane because I went to Humber or Seneca or, and no bash on programs, but we're all in a box from that perspective. How does that reflect broadly in terms of the need for that level of diversity in the workplace generally? Are there places that do it well?
Yeah, so certainly there is a growing, there's been awareness that diversity brings strength to workplaces for all kinds of reasons, right? So you'll hear companies talking about how they want their workforce to reflect their customers, or they want their workforce to reflect the communities that they're within. And, in the past, it's been a little bit of lip service, but as the time has gone on, really, this idea that diversity is actually a necessity has really now become quite mainstream, and is something that organizations are serious about, but struggle to actually do well. So they want, it's aspirational, they want to have it, but in practice, it becomes tricky because, prioritizing diversity means not prioritizing the way that things maybe used to happen in terms of who gets hired, what programs you recruit from, who knows who, what structures are in place that make it really hard for some of the people, like the personas, the profiles that you were just talking about, to be able to gain access. There's a reckoning that's going on in different industries and sectors. So in the Canadian nonprofit sector at the moment, if you look online, you will see enormous discussion going on just about the nature of that sector itself. And while it serves diverse populations, leadership within that sector has not been particularly diverse. So that's an example of where there's a sector that, on the surface looks like it is all about diversity, but points out just the challenges at board level, at senior executive levels of actually walking the talk and saying, this actually matters and we're going to transform ourselves. So if it's challenging in that sector where the understanding of diversity is kind of core to the work that gets done within the sector itself, you can imagine the challenge when you start to move it out into other sectors where the concept of diversity is kind of a nice thing to think about, but not a business priority. And that is really shifting and changing, but it's hard. It's not something that's going to change overnight.
But how much of that challenge has to do with, again, I go back to putting things in boxes. We and I say this with all due respect, but we tick boxes when we talk about diversity. We rarely talk about diversity in experience, diversity in life experience. And that may have little or nothing to do with my ethnic origin.
Right.
And I say that, again, with all due respect to how we're approaching this, but I think sometimes we are looking at diversity, we hem ourselves in, and that's what's happened in newsrooms. We've all got this very generally, we're all on the same path. We bristle at the idea that we're sort of this liberal left-wing media. Well, if you look at our general education, yeah, it's probably in that area, right? We all kind of drank from the same fountain.
Yeah, so there's a pretty cool program that's been imported from, I think it was from the US, that I'm starting to see in communities across Canada. It's called the Human Library. So a Human Library has a list of the people, but it's lived experience. It's not demographic background or racial background or even gendered background, but it's, what's the lived experience of 20 people? And you can sign up and check out a conversation with people that have had these different types of experiences. So whether that's someone who's experienced being unhoused, or whether that's someone who's moved 13 times, or whether that's someone who ran a major corporation, or whatever it is. There's these experience libraries that you can get that actually just encourages dialogue for people to talk with people who may on the surface actually look exactly like them. But to your point, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't great diversity of lived experience that exists there. And to start to imagine the possibilities if we got out of our bubbles and actually talked to people that had very different experiences than us. So that's called a Human Library. And it's a little program in the small that kind of does this in a little way, community by community. But I've often thought, when we're taking a look at diversity initiatives, that, that human library perspective of being able to recognize not just what we can visually see about diversity or what we declare to each other for diversity, but really valuing that experience. We know from our small team at Challenge Factory, each and every one of us has had a very different path to how we ended up at Challenge Factory. You probably find the same thing within Story Studio Network. And it's the richness of those stories, especially in a sector like journalism, where you're all about telling the story and making it relatable, that is so valuable.
It's funny, when you say that, I'm listening to you and I'm grinding it through, because we had just come from this conference here in Toronto. It was called Radio Days, and it was done in conjunction with Canadian Music Week. It's the first time that they have done it in North America. And the whole overarching theme of this conference was, how do we make radio relevant? I mean, off the top, you had talked about your teenage and young adult kids. Yeah, they don't have a connection to the media the same way that we did, at any point in our lives at that stage, certainly. And it's funny how there's a certain diversity in the room, and you could pick them out, and they might have all looked like me, but there was a distinction among those who relied on some flexibility and diversity in their own career experience, and those who insisted on maintaining the path that we're on. We're still talking about doing, the ninth caller wins promotion, and somehow that's going to get me more listeners on the radio, right? There is this, well, that worked in 1972, it's got to work today. That, in fact, within that industry itself, and for the success of it, there's a certain level of self-awareness that the sector has to have to say, this is how we evolve, this is how we develop, this is how we grow, and this is how we sustain maybe some of the smaller startups that you alluded to in this particular area. But I find that the industry in and of itself, it has a hard time getting out of its own way.
Yeah, and a lot of that, I mean, this is common in lots of different industry sectors, geographies, politics. A lot of that, if you boil it down to like what actually is causing people to refuse to see that things have changed when they know that things have changed, is fear and trust. So, at the heart of it, people that really hold on to things that are the way that things have been done in the past is because they're afraid of where they're going to find themselves if things change. And there's a lack of trust that their colleagues, their peers, and others around them actually have them, actually understand their value. And so that individual, sense of fear and lack of trust, and a feeling like there's an element within the industry that is actually not that trustworthy, is what keeps industries from transforming in healthy ways and leads to all kinds of unhealthy behaviors inside of organizations and erodes culture. And again, I come back to the unique nature of journalism. If at the core of what we're seeing is fear and a lack of trust, what does that say about journalism in general, which is kind of there to help ensure that people are making decisions not out of fear and can be trusted? So it's kind of a macro comment on something that's happening inside of an industry where fear and trust are pretty important.
Well, when you put it that way, again, the media keeps looking outwards and saying the general public doesn't trust us and they fear what we have to say. What you're suggesting is that the villain is in the house.
Correct. That's right. In order to be trusted, you have to be trustworthy and you have to be trusting. And if that sense of trust is eroded inside, it's not an external problem, it's an internal problem. And that's where leaders and executives really need to be focused.
It's funny, when we were talking about who wasn't there, it was as much important to say who was at this conference. And, I talked to a couple of guys and they had extra tickets and they were offering them up. And some of these folks I know, and I thought, yeah, they should be here. But then on second thought, I thought, when you go to these things, I don't know what your experience has been, but I come away typically all fired up and excited about what the possibilities are. And Aaron and Jamie and I left the conference just jazzed. I mean, we've got a calendar full of interviews and meetings that have all happened as a result of the networking that we did, and we were all excited about it. And then I thought, okay, those who refused to come didn't come because they didn't think there'd be value. They knew that they would be amped up and excited and inspired, but it wouldn't go anywhere. They would find no support when they went back to the office to get anything done. And it kind of drove home, I think, that what you've just pointed out, that lack of trust and fear in the culture itself. That would be a hard thing to break.
But possible. I mean, it is possible, but the first step in that is recognizing that that's actually job number one, that that's actually what's holding the sector back, and that there needs to be a desire to, first a recognition that that's the problem, and then a desire to fix it. And it doesn't have to be from the top down. It doesn't initially have to start with, on high, the leaders of all of the organizations coming together and saying, you know what, yeah, we have a trust problem. It can start in smaller ways. And it starts by individuals starting to see where they want to be able to be more trusting and starting to have those kinds of conversations. But that fear kicks in, right? It's risky. Yeah.
Well, and then the headline 4 days later after the conference is over, and we've got 1,300 people losing their jobs and 9 radio stations being shuttered or sold. With that in mind, and I've been through this on both sides in terms of the layoffs, and it's really difficult, obviously, to get the notice and say it's not you, it's us, really. So out you go. On the one hand, and it's easy to be glib about that. So the folks who lose their jobs have a certain need for support and everything else. And I know HR really is pretty good at focusing on that. It's almost, scientific in that respect. I don't get the impression that corporately or even in a small, medium-sized enterprise that we're very good at supporting the people who didn't lose their jobs.
Yeah.
And there's almost a survival guilt in there. I can remember after the 08-09 crisis and the number of layoffs that we faced, and trying to keep that team together was really hard, not because they didn't want to be there, not because they didn't like what they were doing. They were shell-shocked.
Yeah, that is very real. And there is, focus, maybe not even enough on the people that left to help them actually navigate to their next steps, but there is something that happens there. And often, you're right, what gets overlooked are the teams that are left behind, that are still in the organization doing the same thing, but without the people that they used to like working with and with real sense of hurt. That also is a hit on trust. So it comes back to the same theme that we have, and a recognition that trust has been broken for the people that are still within the organization, unless the communication has been done exceptionally well. But really focusing on, who is within the organization still, and how do you build an environment that is focused on trust, that isn't focused on fear, if you've just come through a massive round of layoffs that may feel arbitrary. I mean, I've been through those rounds before where it really has nothing to do with the individual people that are on the list. It was just a decision that, we need this many and here's this many and here you go. So how do leaders then refocus and make sure that they're not fostering a culture of fear and that they are focusing on trust and being trustworthy? And that comes down to being human. We always say at Challenge Factory, the future of work is human. It's not technological. So it's not an email solution. It's not an app. It's not a website that people can get information. It's human to human conversations with leaders that require leaders to be human with their staff and to tell them what they can and to explain where they hit areas that they can't give more details, just to be open and honest. But it really is a relationship game at that point. And it's so important because when you're down all of those people that you've just let go, you still need the business to function. Otherwise, this just starts to become a self-professing prophecy, right? That just continues to unravel in front of your eyes. And no leader wants that. I often say no leader wakes up in the morning and their very first thought is, how can I be a total jerk to my workforce today? Like no one does that.
I don't know. I think I work for a couple of those
No,
guys.
They don't. I promise you. That might be what happens along the day. But when they first wake up, that's not their intention. And so support for leaders to get better at having those kinds of conversations and recognizing, yes, they need to focus on operations. Yes, they need to focus on results, but you can't get results if you don't have trust. And so they really need to focus back on trust.
Well, and I'll bring it back to where we started, and and again this exchange that Chapman and I had on LinkedIn over the weekend, and my suggestion being that yes, maybe it's time to reconfigure, rethink what radio, TV, news is doing, and I think at the heart of what you're talking about is actually that level of community that happens within, and we throw the word culture around, but I think we really want to create community. One. And there's probably no better way to do that and touch some of those nerves that you've identified than to have the decision closer to the newsroom, the decision maker closer to the studio, the decision maker closer to the reporter who's out there covering the story. And that to me means either local or regional ownership. And I can see, to your point around the startups, if there's anything good that comes out of this, we're going to see 3 radio stations being purchased by a smaller player in Southern Ontario. Let's see how that thrives, because given the reach of radio in this country, there's no reason why it should be failing as badly as it is. There's great opportunity there. So at the heart of it, I would love to be able to see, some of the smaller, medium-sized markets being able to say, we've got strong local ownership and we know you. We see you on the street. We can talk to you. We touch you. We know what your family does. So back to your point around, you're just not a name on the list that we have to let go. You're actually a contributor to not only our business, but you're our connection to the community.
That's right. I think that's right. And I think that we often forget that Canada is an economy of small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, 90% of the private sector workforce works in companies that have fewer than 500 employees. We are a country of small businesses. And so if the large enterprises start to do things that make it very challenging for communities or for customers or for employees, there is no reason why the small and medium-sized business market can't pick up those pieces. We do it very, very well. We just forget because we, often hear on newscasts and in articles, the big name brand companies as if they're the only ones that are leading the economy, but they're not. And so there's great opportunity for that SME space to come and take over.
Yeah, I won't draw you into the discussion or debate about the CRTC. We'll leave that for another day. So
sounds good.
Lisa Taylor is the president at Challenge Factory. It's always great to have your perspective on this. And given the first day of summer as we chat, I hope you enjoy the season.
And you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Pleasure.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.